Welcome to Moonlight, Love Chapters. We'd be thrilled if you could subscribe to our channel and leave a comment on this video. Thank you so much for your support. May the power of the werewolf be with you. The Awakening of the Moon, The Werewolf's Call. Prologue. The darkness was everywhere, wrapping the earth in cold fingers. In this corner of the world, where the snow never melts and the night devours everything, the living felt only one constant and inevitable law. Nature here knew no mercy. Alaska was its kingdom, its impregnable fortress, where people, despite all their technology, remained nothing more than guests. But this time, nature did not wait. Clouds, like harbingers of disaster, gathered in the sky, hiding the moon that was once called the Deceiver, for it lured and then betrayed. And on this evening, when the plane carrying a group of ecologists rushed through the snowy wastelands, one moment became decisive. It was not meant for them to reach the land they sought. It was not meant for them to study the consequences of oil, for before them was not just nature, but something more, shadows hidden in the forests, ancient beings unseen by humans for centuries. When the deafening explosion shattered the world, all that remained of the people were shadows amidst the white chaos. In that moment, it became clear this was no accident. This was a challenge they were meant to face. The forgotten lands of Alaska began to whisper, and those who survived were no longer the same people. Their fate had been sealed. Now they were no longer just humans. They had become a part of this world. A part of its darkness, its wild, relentless power. And those who survived would have to decide, would they fight against this world or accept it as their new life? The liner shook relentlessly, and every jolt pierced MIA's soul like a hammer strike on metal. She gripped the armrests, trying to stay calm, but the growing internal fear was slowly eroding her composure. Through the porthole, she saw the white ocean of snow stretching below, the endless expanse of Alaska, which seemed so peaceful and unreachable. It felt as though her life was now just a small, far away from all this chaos. Mia glanced around. Everything in the cabin was as usual. The other members of the ecological group sat in their seats, looking as tense and focused as she was. Dan, the flight engineer, was quietly talking to Mark when suddenly a sharp, deafening explosion rang out. The echo was so loud that she felt its wave pass through her body, causing her heart to freeze. The pilots started screaming. Their voices were filled with panic, intensifying the rising sense of terror. The liner lost control. Mia felt her insides flip, and the entire reality shattered, like a broken mosaic, leaving nothing but emptiness. The ground was rapidly approaching, rushing toward her consciousness like in a nightmare. The outside world, already nearly wiped out by the explosion, disappeared. The panicked screams, the crunching metal, and the crackling in her ears merged into one unbearable cacophony. Mia couldn't hold on. Everything around her swallowed her in an instant. She lost consciousness. The metal was tearing, and she could hear the bodies, like toys, flying through the air and falling again. The cold, like a steel knife, pierced her body, but she couldn't move. Only darkness, emptiness. Everything vanished. Mia regained consciousness when the icy wind piercing her skin made her shudder. She inhaled, and the air filled her lungs with the smell of smoke and blood. Her strength was barely returning, but the pain in her body was unmistakable, as if every cell was bound by the cold. She opened her eyes. Around her was utter emptiness. A snowy plain, like an endless white canvas, dimly lit by the faint glow of the cloudy sky. The metallic wreckage of the plane was scattered everywhere, pieces of the wing, engine fragments, and seats, remnants of their catastrophe. It felt like the boundary between reality and nightmare. The sight was so horrifying that Mia could barely believe what was happening. She felt icy needles piercing her skin. It was snow. It seeped into every pore, like pieces of ice, burning her. Mia struggled to get to her knees, clutching her shoulders with her arms. Her body shook from the cold, like a leaf trembling in the wind, but she forced herself to stand. Nearby, there were shouts and noises. Mia turned her head and saw her companions. Dan, the flight engineer, was bent over Lauren, who seemed barely able to breathe from the cold. Her face was bluish, and her lips hardly moved as she tried to inhale. Dan appeared to be saying something, but the sounds were muddled in MIA's head. Mark was sitting on the snow, his hands moving quickly, bandaging a wound on his shoulder. He didn't look as badly hurt, but blood was seeping from his clothes. The wounds were deep but not fatal. Sam, the youngest of the group, had already rummaged through the bags and scattered luggage. He was searching for something that could save them. Food, any supplies, but despair was written all over his face. Mia couldn't tell how much time had passed since the crash. An hour? 2? A day? Everything was distorted by the snowstorm, and reality seemed incomplete, like a shattered mirror. The thought that they could be left here, in this desolate, cold wasteland, with no hope of help, seeped into her mind like poison. If they couldn't find shelter, food, and water, they would all die. Suddenly, Mia felt her heart tighten with fear. A panicked voice in her head screamed that help might never come. They were alone. No assistance, no rescue. In this empty, snowy ocean, they were like microscopic grains of sand. "Mia, are you all right?" Mark's voice sounded. She turned to him, trying to focus on his words, but the world kept spinning in strange distortion. He was wounded, his arm bandaged, but there was desperation in his eyes. "We're all fine, Mia," he said quietly, though with difficulty. "We need to gather our strength and survive." She nodded. Everything in her mind was a blur, but she knew that they needed to stick together now. If they didn't survive, it would be the end for all of them. Night descended upon the endless snowy expanse, and the frost grew even more brutal. The temperature dropped, reaching -40. The wind, piercing to the bone, howled like an evil creature racing through the empty sky. Mia sat by the fire, which was barely holding on, offering only faint warmth that could not fight the icy air. Their lips had turned white, and their breath turned to clouds of steam, disappearing into the fog of the night. She felt her fingers and toes start to numb as her body gradually lost the ability to move. Her stomach ached with hunger, and Mia could only imagine how she must have looked, exhausted, tortured by cold and hunger. For a time, her mind went blank. Only the pain remained, slowly consuming her thoughts. "We need to head toward the nearest settlement," Dan said, his voice desperate but tinged with some kind of call. "If we stay here, we won't survive the night. Someone has to find us. I'm sure there are people nearby." But his words brought no comfort. They had no idea where to find the settlement. No one knew where to go. All around them was only the endless white sea. They had no map, no clear landmarks. All they knew was that their survival depended on miracle rescuers, who they might never meet. Mark and Loren remained silent, their eyes clouded with cold and fatigue. Sam, as always, was rummaging through the luggage bags, hoping to find something edible. But nearly everything left was either damaged or inedible. "Maybe we should at least try?" Sam whispered, raising his eyes filled with fear and desperation. But in his eyes, there was no certainty, only the growing realization that their chance of survival was shrinking with each moment. Time dragged unbearably slowly, but soon the silence of the night was broken. In the distance, a light appeared. It was dim and sinister. Mia stared at it anxiously. She thought it might be an illusion, a product of her worn-out mind. Then she noticed them. Eyes. yellow, unblinking, like a fire either burning the darkness or consuming it from within. Eyes that were too bright in this snowy hell. They did not move, did not blink. They were unnaturally still, as if foreign to this reality, like two glowing flames in the emptiness. Mia felt her heart race. These were not just eyes. These were not people. They were something else. At first, she thought they might be wolves. But no. These eyes were not wolfish. They were intelligent, observant, and there was something in them that made her blood freeze. Mia could feel the gaze penetrating her, studying her every movement. It was as though her entire existence at that moment was under the scrutiny of these ominous eyes. The eyes vanished as quickly as they had appeared, leaving only emptiness and cold. But Mia knew this was not just a vision, not a hallucination. Something was nearby, something unimaginably dangerous. Gathering her strength, she turned to the others, but their faces were so distorted by fear and exhaustion that no one noticed the eyes disappearing. Silence fell upon them again, but now it was different. Not like before. The silence of the night was broken by a sinister rustling, growing closer. Mia could feel her heart beating faster, and the fear that had begun to creep inside her became more and more apparent. She glanced around, but all she saw was impenetrable darkness and snow slowly filling the space around them. Nothing seemed to be happening, but her gut told her. They were near. Then, from the forest, huge shadows leaped out. Mia immediately knew they were not wolves. These were creatures moving with such agility, it seemed their feet barely touched the ground. The shadows grew, filling the space around them, and the air thickened with heavy breathing, as though something enormous and dangerous was following them. One of the werewolves leapt out of the darkness and immediately pounced on Loren. Her scream, piercing the night's silence, made Mia flinch. It was filled with pain and fear, and in that moment, Mia felt her body fill with terror. Loren, like all of them, was weak, frozen, exhausted, and the werewolf easily knocked her to the ground. She fell into the snow, and the beast was already above her, ready to deliver the killing blow. Without hesitation, Mark grabbed a piece of pipe lying nearby and struck the beast in the face with furious force. The werewolf howled, but did not retreat. It only bared its teeth, full of rage, and seemed to feel no pain. Mia saw its eyes, yellow like two flames, full of hatred and thirst for blood. These eyes were not like those of animals. They were intelligent, greedy, and they saw their weaknesses and knew how to manipulate them. The creatures surrounded them, advancing slowly, as if savoring the fear spreading through their veins. Mia felt her hands and legs refusing to obey her. She couldn't move, couldn't find the strength to act. Horror paralyzed her body, and only one moment of clarity passed through her mind. If she didn't do something right now, they would all die. The smell of wet fur and blood mixed with the cold and the deadly sense of doom. These creatures were not ordinary animals. They were werewolves. They were human and yet not human. Their minds were not as simple as a wild animal's. They did not attack just for food. They attacked for something greater, something Mia couldn't understand. Mark kept fighting, but the beast that had struck Loren was not the only one. More and more figures were leaping from the forest. There were at least 6 of them, and each was ready to strike. They were closing in, and the group was clearly losing ground. Mia felt her breath grow heavy, her blood draining from her face. She knew their chances of survival were almost non-existent, but she couldn't give up. With her stomach full of hunger, she remembered she had to do something. In her hand, a piece of metal, a knife. It was their only chance. Mia grabbed it, and summoning all her strength, took a step forward. Her sudden movement didn't go unnoticed. One of the werewolves turned to her, and their eyes met. There was no fear in them, only cold threat. It made a sound, like a laugh, and Mia's heart squeezed in her chest. For a moment, she felt that this was the end. But Lorenz suddenly managed to rise, pushing herself from the snow with difficulty. She threw a stone at another werewolf, distracting its attention. That moment saved them, as she drew the attention to herself, giving Mark and Mia a chance. Mark struck one of the werewolves in the head with force, and it fell. The others, however, kept coming, but their numbers had thinned, and the group now had a chance to survive. At that moment, when everything seemed decided, Mia made one more desperate move. With incredible strength, she threw the knife, and it struck one of the werewolves, piercing its hide and forcing it to retreat. But it was only for a moment before the others surrounded them once more. Mia regained consciousness from the cold and pain, feeling her body resist every movement. She opened her eyes, but didn't see the familiar vast white expanse. Instead, towering snow-covered mountains surrounded her, and above them, it seemed as though the entire cloudy sky hung low, blocking the sun. The wind howled like the moan of lost souls, seeping into her bones and making every muscle tense from the cold. Mia tried to stand, but her legs refused to obey. Fatigue and the fear she'd experienced while fighting the werewolves held her captive. But something was wrong. She realized they hadn't stayed in the forest. The sky was unusually dark, and the snow around her wasn't as pure white anymore. It was dirty, soaked with something foul, as if it had become part of the surrounding nightmare. Their captors walked on both sides of them. These creatures, once their enemies, now led them through the snowy wasteland. Their feet moved with ease, almost dancing on the snow, while Mia felt her body lagging behind, unable to move at her usual pace. She tried to look around, but all she saw were the rough backs of the werewolves, their wild, unnatural shapes resembling wolves, but with human traits. Step by step, they moved, as if this was a familiar task for these beings, while their small group, like toys, followed without resistance. They were all still alive, though barely able to move. Lauren was still too weak, Dan could hardly stand, and Mark looked like he had exhausted all his strength in fighting the wolves. Mia herself could barely stand, but something in their merciless eyes made her keep moving, not walking, dragging herself behind them, as if each step brought her closer to the inevitable. When they reached the camp, Mia felt a sudden wave of terror. The place seemed like something from a nightmare. In its center were crude wooden huts, crooked and decaying, with smoldering fires at the entrances. Around them stood people. They looked strange, wolfish eyes that seemed almost human, but with something else, something unnatural. And the beastly features on their faces revealed not just humans, but something far older, something that had long lost its human essence. Mia noticed that these beings paid no attention to them, continuing with their tasks, tending to the fire, performing some actions, as if they were part of a world that could not be understood. "This is their home," Lauren whispered weakly, clinging to Dan's back. He tugged at her shoulder, trying to help her move forward. "We're here. Forever." Mia couldn't speak a word. She stood frozen, watching as one of the werewolves, the one who had been their leader, Edric, approached the camp, casting a glance at their group. His eyes burned like two amber flames shining in the night. He slowly walked up to the fire and turned, meeting Mia's gaze. "This is not just survival," he said, his voice heavy and authoritative. "Here, we live by laws you cannot understand, but you will become part of this world if you survive." Mia felt the cold clutch her heart, and for a moment, she realized that these were not just words, but something more. It was not a warning, but an invitation. Survival depended on how well they could learn to live by these laws. And worse still, these creatures knew no mercy. The werewolves dispersed throughout the camp, leaving them under guard. Tears welled in Mia's eyes, but she couldn't afford to appear weak. They were all prisoners, and it was unclear what would happen to them next. When Edric, a tall and imposing man with a scar across his face, spoke his words, Mia felt everything inside her freeze. His words were like a sentence. They hadn't just survived. Now they were part of something much more terrifying than they had ever imagined. Edric wasn't just a leader. He was the lawgiver of their new world. His words rang with such an iron tone that there was no doubt. They now belonged to the pack, and their lives depended on a power not in their hands. Mia struggled to process the information. They, the ecologists, had entered a world where survival was only possible if they proved their worth.
Strength.
The question wasn't about knowledge or intelligence, only strength. The werewolves surrounding them kept returning to this, proved they could survive in their world, by their rules or die, becoming yet another victim. "You're strong," Edric said, almost reading her thoughts. "I see the fire in your eyes. You can become one of us if you endure the test." His voice was both gentle and terrifying, as if he knew his words should fill her with fear, but perhaps he even hoped for it. His gaze, full of confidence and hidden threat, pierced into her soul, making her doubt her own ability to survive. Mia felt the icy fear constricting her heart, and she understood there was no choice. If she didn't pass the test, if she didn't show her strength, her life would have no value. They would be like all the others, lives that weren't worth a single glance, a single gesture, forgotten in this dead world. Soon, the trials began. The werewolves didn't kill them immediately. They made them survive, as though it were routine. Lauren fell ill. She could barely stand, her breath heavy, her eyes dull from fever. Dan, as always, was by her side, but his efforts to help seemed futile. He tried to find something to ease her suffering, but in this wild, alien place, there were no medicines, no familiar means of help. Mark found himself in a different situation. He was taken away, and Mia couldn't understand what would happen to him. He had to fight one of the wolves. In battle, for reasons unknown, for reasons unclear, but it was part of their law, and Mark couldn't refuse. This trial had to prove his strength. Before Mia could fully process the situation, Edric himself approached her. His gaze was cold and penetrating, but he said nothing. He simply came closer, quietly observing her. Mia felt her muscles tighten with fear. She didn't know what awaited her, but she knew that from this moment, her life would be different. Edric spoke, and his words sounded like a sentence. "You will pass the test. I have chosen you. This is your chance to prove your strength. Don't fail me." Mia stared at him, trying to grasp his words. Her heart pounded wildly, and every nerve in her body screamed danger. But what was she to do? Refuse? Become another victim? Too much was at stake. "You're strong," Edric repeated, his voice almost tender, but with an underlying threat. "I was right about you. Your strength, your fire, that's what we need." Mia felt her mind fill with both fear and resolve. Fear that she might not be able to handle it, and resolve, knowing that she had no choice but to test her strength. Because if she didn't succeed, her life in this world of werewolves would end, just like her friends' lives. And she knew for sure that she didn't want that. Edric turned and, without saying another word, motioned for her to follow him. She couldn't understand what awaited her, but she walked into this world full of threats and rules that were foreign to her, but on which her life depended. Mia sat by the fire, staring into the flames. The air was unusually cold at night, but she didn't feel it. The words of Edric still echoed in her mind, his revelation that was not only shocking but strangely captivating. "We are not monsters," he had said. "We are an ancient people. We were here long before humans arrived. We are the ones who lived and survived in these forests, in these mountains, in these snowy wastelands. But our clan is dying. We cannot continue without new members. We need someone to become part of us. And you could be that part." Edric had looked at her with such a serious expression that she felt a cold shiver run through her skin. Mia couldn't fully understand what he meant. She was human, just an ordinary human. She was an ecologist, a scientist, someone who believed in science, in facts, not myths. But something in her soul had responded to his words. There was something in the way he spoke, in his confidence, in his knowledge, that made her think. He wasn't lying to her. He was sincere. And there was something ominous about that. Edric continued, "We do not want to kill. We do not want to destroy those who dare to enter our land. But our people are on the brink of extinction. We can no longer exist as we once did. You see it, don't you? Every year, our clan loses strength. Without new, strong members, we are doomed." Mia felt something tighten in her chest. She glanced at her companions. Dan, Lauren, and Sam. All of them were sitting nearby, but their eyes were cloudy, tired. They didn't speak, but in their gazes, she saw the same anxiety that gripped her soul. And she knew that none of them could return to the world they had once believed in. "I never thought it would be like this," Mia whispered, gazing into the darkness where their new masters were hidden in the forest. Edric understood her doubts, but didn't condemn her. He stepped closer, and his voice lowered to almost a whisper. "You felt it, didn't you?" he asked. "You felt something stir inside you?" Mia couldn't answer. She didn't even know what exactly she was feeling, but something inside her was definitely there. It wasn't just a feeling of fear or anxiety. It was something else. It was like a premonition, a call coming from nature itself, from the earth. Edric's voice continued to resonate in her ears. "You hear it, Mia? It's a call. It's the voice of your true essence. A voice calling you under the moonlight. You are not just human. You are something more. You are part of us, part of this land." His words echoed in her mind. Mia tried to resist, but in her body, there was an inevitability, as if her very blood was now responding to this summons. She could feel her body reacting to the night sky, to the light of the moon, as if this energy was familiar to her. At that moment, she realized she was not just an ecologist, not just a human, but something more. "You must understand," Edric continued, "that we cannot live by the laws that humans live by. We cannot exist in their world. We must be part of this world, here and now. We are children of nature, and nature demands sacrifices from us. We must change our kind. We must continue. We must be strong." These words sounded like an ancient oath, like a spell that was increasingly affecting her consciousness. She felt her body responding to Edric's words, as if the earth itself wanted her to become part of something great, ancient, and inevitable. The voice in her soul grew louder, urging her to act. This call grew stronger with each passing moment, and she knew she couldn't ignore it. "Did you feel it, Mia?" Edric asked, his voice now sounding almost like a command. "Do you feel your blood pulsing under the moon?" Mia lifted her gaze. The moon shone brightly. Its light seemed especially cold and mystical, as if it were part of something ancient and alive. And she, as if forgetting everything, her past, her fears, stepped into that light, as though following the call of her new path. She didn't know what would happen next, but one thing was clear: she could no longer be who she had been. When the night swallowed them, and the snowfall began to cover their tracks, Mark decided it was time to leave. He had thought it through for a long time, planned. His inner voice whispered that they needed to escape while there was still a chance. Edric, despite his confidence and strength, could not keep them in this village forever. Freedom called like a saving fire in the dark night. They broke free. For a while, they managed to keep calm and remain hidden. Lauren, weakened by illness, could barely walk, but despite that, They moved faster. Mia and Dan supported her, sometimes pulling her out of deep snowdrifts. The noisy, heavy breaths of their pursuers seemed to never stop. The wolves were closer than they could imagine, but they kept moving, never looking back. They knew that if they didn't make it deeper into the forest, if they didn't hide far enough, they wouldn't survive. With every step, Mia felt a rising anxiety, knowing that the wolves from the pack were close, that their breath was not just animal-like, but something more. It felt as if they were being watched by more than predators, but by something greater, something ancient. And the fear wasn't from the possibility of being caught, but from the fact that this chase had become a part of their existence. Mark still seemed to believe they could escape, but his resolve didn't last long. Soon, he, by all signs, realized that their chances of success were fading. Speeding up, he decisively said something as a final command. "Run." Then a sharp, piercing scream echoed. It was Mark. And almost immediately after, his body, shapeless, thrown to the ground, torn apart. Lauren screamed, but Dan covered her mouth, realizing that their time was running out. They couldn't stop. They were too close to death to allow another weakness. The heavy breathing continued to chase them, the steps growing nearer. Soon, Lauren couldn't walk anymore. Neither she nor the others had any strength left. Dan tried to keep her on her feet, but her body felt heavier, her face covered with fear. Mia could feel her weakness and anxiety, but there was nothing she could do to change it. Then they saw him. Edric, like a ghost, emerged from the shadows. He stood among the trees, his head held high, as if he were part of the night, merging with the forest. He walked towards them, his steps leaving no trace in the snow. The only thing left of his presence was a gaze full of power, confidence, and authority. He said nothing, just stood before Mia and folded his arms across his chest. Her heart began to beat faster, and she felt her gaze being drawn to his power. He wasn't just the leader of the pack, he was its essence, its part, its embodiment. "You are one of us," Edric said. "You know this, Mia. We won't leave you. If you go, you will die in this forest." Her gaze met his eyes, and there was no threat in his look. It was a fact. He was right. She couldn't go back. Fear receded like sand before a powerful current. Mia understood that her life, even if she left, would never be the same. She had already felt what he had spoken of. Ancient, unknown, eternal. Her blood responded to his words as if it had come home. The call she felt in her soul wasn't just fear. It was something more, a call of strength, a call of nature, a call of the pack. She couldn't leave. She couldn't turn her back. She knew she wouldn't survive without it, just as light cannot survive without shadow. She nodded, her chest filling with heavy breaths, and she stepped forward. "I'm staying," she said, her voice firm despite all the confusion in her soul. The fear had gone, replaced by an ancient feeling of belonging she couldn't explain. Edric smiled, as if expecting this answer. "You made the right choice," he said. "You will live." Mia felt something begin to change within her body. The call of the moon was so powerful that it seemed as if the very earth itself responded to the summons. Each breath she took was filled with a new sensation, indescribable, yet familiar. Lightness and heaviness mixed in her chest, and her mind began to dissolve into the dark flow of instincts. Her skin, which once seemed so fragile, now filled with fire. Every cell of her body cracked like old wood under the strike of lightning. She felt her bones break, compress, but in that moment, they healed, fusing together, becoming stronger and more resilient than ever. Her muscles expanded, becoming flexible and powerful. Strength pulsed in her veins, not human strength, but that which was part of the night, part of the moonlight, part of this ancient people, part of the pack. Mia screamed, unable to suppress the changes happening in her body. This sound was not human. It was the cry of a primal being awakening once more. She felt her mind dissolve in the process, her personality becoming part of something greater. With each passing moment, her perception changed. She no longer saw the world through human eyes. In her new body, everything felt different, sharper, stronger. She could smell the forest, the scents that had been hidden from her previous consciousness. The sounds of the night grew louder, and every step, every vibration in the air seemed important and significant. Edric, standing nearby, watched her transformation with pride and respect. His eyes shone, and there was no fear in them. He was her mentor, her guide into this new world. He was not the enemy, as she had once thought. He was her teacher, and she followed him. When the final step was taken, and her body took its new form, she felt a power rise in her eyes, a power she knew well. She saw in Edric not just a man, but a leader, just as she was now. In his eyes, she read not just words. It was a gaze filled with understanding, knowledge, and strength. They were connected, and this bond became inevitable for her. She took a step forward, toward a new beginning. "I'm ready," she said, her voice deep and firm. This was not just her voice. It was the voice of the pack, a voice that had now become part of her. Edric smiled and shook his head, as if saying, "You were always ready." Weeks passed. The outside world no longer knew them. When the rescuers found the wreckage of the plane, they searched for survivors, but found no one. Everything was covered in snow, empty, lifeless. It was a place where people disappeared. But in the forest, among the mountains and snow, something was still alive. And it was something more than just people. Sometimes local residents, walking through the area, spoke of strange beings they had seen among the hills. Their silhouettes were tall and slender, with eyes that glowed in the dark like little fires on the moon. These beings were not wolves, but they were not humans either. They moved as though they blended with nature, as though they were part of it, with its breath and its rhythm. And when the full moon rose over Alaska, a howl echoed through the snow. It was not just a sound, it was the voice of a new pack, a voice that reverberated through the night, piercing the silence. It was full of power and ancient energy. It was the voice of those who were more than just humans. This was the beginning of a new era, an era where they were no longer human but something more,